Shabbat Shalom, everyone. We're glad you're here with us tonight. Tonight is a special night because we're celebrating our Seder. And we're just going to have a real nice time here, giving thanks to the Lord, giving him praise. And Rabbi Gary's going to walk us through all the elements of what the Passover has to offer us. And it's an amazing, awesome trip that we're going to go through with him. So come with us now. Let's praise his name together. And if you're just sitting at home, you can get off you can clap your hands, you can run around, and just be joyful with us this evening. Hallelujah. The one who calms the raging storm, the one who walked upon the sea, earth and heaven is your own, yet you're watching over me. How majestic is your name, 'cause there is none like you. There is none like you. Together we proclaim the power of your name, for there is none like you. Who can stand before your throne? Your kingdom will forever reign. We will sing a song of praise to the Ancient of Days. How majestic, how majestic is your name, 'cause there is none like you. There is none like you. Together we proclaim the power of your name, 'cause there is none like you. Come on, let's sing that together now. There is none like you. There is none like you. Think among them like your life. There is none like you. Think among them like your life. Together we proclaim the power of your name. There is none like you. How majestic, how majestic is your name. How majestic is your name. How majestic is your name in all the earth. How majestic is your name. How majestic is your name. How majestic is your name in all the earth. 'Cause there is none like you. Well, there is none like you. Come on, let's put your hands together now. Together we proclaim the power of your name. 'Cause there is none like you. Let's sing it together now. There is none like you. There is none like you. There is none like you. Together we proclaim the power of your name. 'Cause there is none like you. How majestic, how majestic is your name. There is none like you. Mikamoka Adonai. There is none like you. Mikamoka Adonai. Together we proclaim the power of your name. 'Cause there is none like you. One more time. There is none like you. Mikamoka Adonai. There is none like you. Mikamoka Adonai. Together we proclaim the power of your name. 'Cause there is none like you. Hallelujah. There is none like you, Lord.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kiddushanu al yedei emunah beYeshua HaMashiach, or haolam, uv'shemo anu madlikim haner shel Yom Tov. Blessed are you, O Lord our God, King of the universe, who has sanctified us through faith in Yeshua the Messiah, the light of the world, and in his name we kindle the Yom Tov lights. And a king shall come forth from the sons of Yeshai, and from his descendants the Mashiach shall be anointed. And the Spirit of the Lord will rest upon him, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel, and might, the Spirit of knowledge and the fear of the Lord. Amen.
Well, Shabbat Shalom, everyone. It's a real joy to have you with us this night on Passover. It's the third night of Passover. It's also Good Friday, as Christians are celebrating that moment when Messiah gave his life a ransom for many. And it's also Shabbat Eve, this Friday evening, as the Sabbath begins. And we're just overjoyed to have you with us. My name is Rabbi Gary Deroshinsky, and this is Congregation Beth Ariel. Before we start our Passover Seder, let me just say a few things about our congregation. When we begin our in-person services, we'll begin again Saturday morning, 11 a.m., right here in Tarzana in Los Angeles. We're located at 5901 Lindley Avenue in Tarzana. We meet at the Lindley Church every Saturday morning. So if any of you are visiting Los Angeles, you're here in Southern California, and you're able to join us some Saturday morning at 11 a.m., we'd love to have you come and worship with us. And when our in-person service begins again, also on Saturday night at 6 p.m., we have service in Valencia in Santa Clarita, a little ways north here in Los Angeles. So we'd love to have you come at any one of those services. If you'd like to connect with us, all you need to do is to get to our homepage at bethariel.org, and you'll find out all kinds of things about Beth Ariel and our congregation here. And if you'd like to partner with us, you can do that by clicking on the donation page that's right there on the Beth Ariel homepage. You can write us at Beth Ariel, 5340, P.O. Box 5340, West Hills, California, 91308. And so we'd love to have you in touch with us and be a part of our ministry. Now, on our homepage, we have a online Passover button. If you clicked on that, you would have seen a list of items that you could have gotten so that you could partake with us as we celebrate Passover. So if you have those items with you, just lay them out on the table and join us in celebrating Passover. Passover celebrates the deliverance of the Jewish people from Egypt. But it's more than just deliverance from Egypt. It really celebrates the covenantal relationship that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob has with his chosen people, the people of Israel. And when the story of the Exodus opens up, we remember that there was a Pharaoh on the throne of Egypt, it says in Exodus chapter 1, who did not know Joseph. When it says he didn't know Joseph, it's not that he didn't know about Joseph or he didn't know the history of Egypt. Rather, it means that he didn't have a personal relationship with Joseph. He didn't care about Joseph, and he didn't care about Joseph's people. In fact, he feared the Israelites who dwelt in the land of Egypt. He was concerned that perhaps if an enemy from outside the land would ever attack the Egyptians, perhaps the Israelites would join with their enemies. And so Pharaoh did three things in order to ensure that the Jewish people would not revolt against him. First of all, he set up taskmasters to afflict the Israelites with heavy bondage. But the scripture says the more that they afflicted the Israelites, the more that they multiplied. So Pharaoh then commissioned the midwives to slay all the male children that were born. But it says that the midwives feared God. They wouldn't do as Pharaoh had commanded. And the Lord blessed the midwives, it says, by giving them their own homes. So then Pharaoh commissioned his soldiers to go throughout the land of Egypt to take all the Jewish male children and to drown them in the river. Perhaps the Nile River or one of its tributaries is meant. It was in this point that Jochebed and Amram, the parents of Moses, saved Moses by placing him in what we imagine is like a little wicker basket that's overlaid with tar and pitch. But you know, the same Hebrew word for Moses' little basket that floated on the waters of the Nile is the same Hebrew word that's used for Noah's Ark. In fact, it's the only two places in the Bible where that word is found. And so Moses' little ark did the trick that Noah's Ark had done. It floated upon the waters, and Moses floated upstream into the hands of Pharaoh's daughter. Pharaoh's daughter fishes him out of the water. That's where we get his name Moses from, which means to draw forth. And Jochebed had told her daughter Miriam to watch Moses as he floated upstream. And so when Pharaoh's daughter fished Moses out of the water, she saw Moses' sister and said to her to go get the child's mother. And so Amram and Jochebed were honored in their faith, and they received Moses back into their care to raise him up during those early formative years of his life. That's how he knew he was a Hebrew. But later in Moses' life, as he grows up in the land of Egypt, he sees an Israelite who is being killed, being slain. And he takes revenge on this Egyptian taskmaster. He kills the Egyptian taskmaster, and then he runs from the land of Egypt into the land of Midian, the southern area of the Sinai Peninsula. It's there that he meets up with Jethro, marries his daughter Zipporah. He has his firstborn son Gershom, but more importantly, he sees a spectacle. He sees a bush that is burning and is not being consumed. He draws close to that bush, which was near Mount Horeb, where he later will receive the Mosaic Law, the 10 tablets of the 10 commandments on the tablets of stone. And as he draws closer to the bush, the angel of the Lord speaks to him from the bush and tells Moses that he wants to use Moses to deliver his people Israel. And he tells him that he's to go back to Egypt and he's to give Pharaoh this message. He's to say, Israel is my son, even my firstborn. And if you don't let him go to worship me in the wilderness, I will slay your son, even your firstborn. Moses asks the angel of the Lord, who should he tell the Israelites has sent him? And the Lord tells him his personal sacred name. And so armed with the name of God, Aaron, his brother, joins him. He returns back to the land of Egypt. He's now some 80 years old. And as he comes back to the land of Egypt, he then goes before Pharaoh and begins to tell him what God had told him to say, to let my people go. And what God does now through Moses is to respond in kind in the way that the Egyptians had mistreated the Jewish people. Just as the Egyptians set up taskmasters over the Israelites to afflict them with heavy bondage, now the Lord is going to set up taskmasters over the Egyptians to afflict them with heavy bondage. The affliction that he will bring about the Egyptians comes in the form of the 10 plagues. And each one of those plagues is a judgment on the false gods of Egypt. The Egyptians worshiped the Nile River and as a fertility god. And so the Lord would turn all the water in Egypt to blood. The Egyptians worshiped the sun god Ra. He would turn it to darkness. The Egyptians worshiped the Eked. The Eked, that was the name for the frogs. And he would plague Egypt with frogs. Each one of those plagues was a judgment on the false gods of Egypt in order to embitter the lives of the Egyptians the way that they had embittered the lives of the Israelites. And then, just as Pharaoh had commissioned the midwives to slay the firstborn male children of the Israelites, God now sends forth the angel of death throughout all the land of Egypt to slay all the firstborn in the land of Egypt. The only firstborn sons that would be spared were those that were in homes marked with the sprinkling of the blood of the lamb on the two side doorposts and upper lintel. Then Pharaoh allows the Israelites to go. But as they exit from the land of Egypt and as they become confronted by the Red Sea, Pharaoh has a change of heart. He pursues the Israelites. And when the Israelites come to the Red Sea, the Lord tells Moses to stretch forth his staff. And when he does so, the waters part, and the Israelites cross the Red Sea on dry ground. But when the Egyptian army pursuing the Israelites, the Egyptian army that was commissioned to drown the Jewish children in one of the waterways of Egypt, when they sought to pursue the Israelites through the Red Sea, the Lord caused the winds to blow, the waters to recede, and the Egyptian army was drowned in the midst thereof. God had promised Abraham, I'll bless them that bless thee, and I'll curse them that curse thee. The story of the Exodus is the story of God's faithfulness to his promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It's a story about God's covenantal love toward his people Israel. And so as we celebrate Passover this night, we celebrate the wonderful relationship that we can have with the God of the universe, with the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. If we just join ourselves to him, bow before him humbly, receive Messiah into our lives, and receive life anew. When Passover is celebrated, it initiates the 8-day festival of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So the night before Passover, the father and his youngest son go throughout the household to make sure that all leavened products are taken out of the house. In my home, growing up in an Orthodox Jewish home, we had separate set of dishes, one for Passover, one for the normal time of the year. All breads, cakes, and cookies were taken out of the house, anything that contained yeast. But the night before Passover, my father would hand me a candle. He would take a wooden spoon and a feather, and we would go in search of the leaven. Traditionally, the father is to search every room, and he's to look even to the very corners of every room, and wherever he found leaven, he would sweep it into the wooden spoon. If most Jewish fathers were like my father, who didn't really want to go through all of that detail, he would sit at the table and he would say, now we're going to say the prayer, and he would close his eyes and say the prayer. My mother would have some breadcrumbs, and she would have it in a napkin, and she'd put it right in front of him. And then after he would pray, he'd open his eyes and he'd say, you see, Gary, there is the leaven that we have to purge out from our household. He would take that leaven, wrap it in a linen cloth, we'd take it outside, and we would burn it as a sign and symbol that our household has been cleansed of all leaven so that we could celebrate Passover. Now, that tradition may seem a little extreme for many of us, but if we don't know that tradition, we can't rightly understand the New Testament. Because Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 5 says, your glorying is not good. Don't you know that a little leaven leavens the whole lump? Purge out the old leaven that ye may be unleavened, for Messiah our Passover has been sacrificed for us. Wherefore let us keep the feast, not with the old leaven of wickedness and malice, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. So just as the household was to be cleansed of leaven to celebrate Passover, so Paul is saying we need to go through the same extreme discipline to have sin purged from our lives, so that we can celebrate Messiah, our Passover, who has been sacrificed for us. Now that our household has been cleansed, now the father of the household wears certain garments he may not wear during the normal part of the year in order to celebrate Passover. One thing the father would wear is the tallis, or the tzitzis, the tassels that hang at the four corners of the tallis. If they're made correctly, it ought to have 613 knots on these four uniquely knotted strands. 613 because there are 613 laws in the Mosaic law. So this represents the law that God had given to his people Israel. The Jewish father wraps these tassels in his fingers, and before putting the tallis on, he says a prayer for the regathering of the Jewish people who have been dispersed to the four corners of the earth. And so now that the father has said the prayer, he wraps the prayer shawl over his shoulders, and then over the prayer shawl he puts on a white garment which is called the kittel. Jewish men wear the kittel on a variety of occasions. They wear them on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, and it symbolizes the forgiveness of sin. And as they experience atonement from sin, they want to be dressed in white, symbolizing God's forgiveness of their sin. At their deaths, they are wrapped in a kittel so that they might be ushered into the presence of God dressed in white, even as the angels in heaven are thought to be so arrayed in white. Once the father wraps the kittel around him and ties the belt around him to secure the kittel in place, then he also puts on his head the kippah, to cover his head in reverence before the Lord. And sometimes it's pointed out that the kippah is representative of the office in Israel known as the kings. And so it represents the kings of Israel. Even as the father is the head of his household, like the king of his house, so he wears the kippah or a mitre, representing the kingship or the office of a king. When the father wears the kittel on this night, he wears it in representation of the priests. The priests in Israel were commissioned with the law of God, and they were entrusted with the law, and they were to teach the law to the people of Israel. Tonight, the father is going to fulfill that Levitical responsibility in teaching the laws of the Passover to his family. So tonight, the father wears these two garments that indicate these two most important offices in Israel, the king and the priest. What's interesting is that no one Israelite could ever be both king and priest at the same time. For to be a king, he had to be from the tribe of Judah, the family of David. To be a priest, he had to be from the tribe of Levi or one of the priestly families. But on this night, the Father unifies these two offices in his one person. How illustrative that is of our Messiah, who is both our King, for he's King of all kings and Lord of all lords, but he is our King as the Son of David, but he's also our priest. He's not just our priest, he's our great high priest who always makes intercession for us. So in a very real sense, the father of the Passover table represents the hope of the coming Messiah this night. For Passover is a Messianic festival. It's on this night that the Jewish people believe that Messiah may come. They weren't wrong about that. In fact, Messiah did come on Passover. He did give his life a ransom for many on Passover. That's when Yeshua, the Messiah of Israel, died for our sin and carried our burdens and carried our sorrows, even as Isaiah the prophet had prophesied. But now that the Father is properly dressed, then the Passover traditions are ready to get started. What transpires first is that we have the kindling or the lighting of the Passover candles. Everyone is given a Haggadah, this little booklet that I have in my hand. The Haggadah comes from the Hebrew word nagad, which means to tell. This is going to tell us the story and the traditions of Passover. When the candles are lit, only the mother of the household is permitted to light these candles on this night. She says the blessing, Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu, lehadlik ner shel yom tov. Blessed are you, O Lord our God, King of the universe, who has sanctified us with your commandments and commanded us to kindle the festival lights. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, shechechiyanu v'kiyamanu v'higiyanu lazman haseh. Blessed are you, O Lord our God, King of the universe, who has brought us life and has sustained us and has enabled us to reach this season of joy. With that, the mother of the household will light our Passover candles. I said earlier that only the mother of the household can light these candles because on this night, as I said before, the Jewish people believe and hope that Messiah will come this night. And so, because we anticipate Messiah may come, these candles represent the hope of Messiah's coming. And if he comes, he would be the light of the world. The mother of the household alone is permitted to light these candles because of the two prophecies that associate Messiah's coming with that of the woman. Genesis 3:15 says that the seed of a woman, a descendant of a woman, will come and crush the serpent's head. All understood, the earliest rabbis understood that promise to be a promise of the coming of Messiah who would destroy the work of the evil one. And then we remember in Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14, Isaiah said, Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel, God with us. The ancient rabbis understood this to be a prophecy of the coming Messiah, and that he is associated with that of the woman, in this case, the virgin that would give birth to him. So because of these prophecies that associate the coming of the Messiah with that of the woman, so the woman of the household alone is allowed to light these candles in the hope and anticipation that Messiah might come tonight. Once our candles are lit, there are 4 cups of wine or juice that are partaken of this night. Each cup has a name to it, and each cup symbolizes a different stage in the deliverance of the Jewish people from Egypt. The first cup is called the Kiddush Cup. It comes from the Hebrew word kodesh, which means to set apart. The first cup, the Kiddush Cup, will set apart this night from all other nights. It's a unique night because it's the night of Passover. It's a unique night because it's the first of the 7 major festivals that the Jewish people are to observe. It's a unique night because it's a night in which we anticipate and hope that Messiah may come. The father leads the family in saying the blessing, Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, borei peri hagafen. Blessed are you, O Lord our God, King of the universe, creator of the fruit of the vine. And all would partake together. And after they partake, the father then indicates what all this symbolizes. You know, when Yeshua, the Messiah, celebrated Passover with his disciples, he also partook of these Jewish traditions. We know that he partook of the first cup, the Kiddush Cup, because he told his disciples, this is the last time I will celebrate Passover with you before I suffer. And he said, I will no longer drink of the fruit of the vine until I drink it anew with you in the kingdom. When he used the phrase fruit of the vine, that's part of the blessing formula. And thus he said those words at the very beginning of the Passover, and he said them over the drinking of the first cup, the Kiddush Cup. After the first cup is partaken of, then the father has each and every person have their hands washed. The mother of the household takes a wash basin. She'll have a towel. The father and the family will put their hands over the wash basin. She'll then pour some water over his hands to wash his hands. And the father will say the blessing before they partake of the foods. He'll say, Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, Asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu al netilat yadayim. Blessed are you, O Lord our God, King of the universe, who has sanctified us by your commandments and commanded us to wash our hands. Now, when Messiah gathered with his disciples, he also partook of this tradition as well. He partook of the first cup. I will no longer drink of the fruit of the vine till I drink it anew with you in the kingdom. But he also washed the disciples. Yeshua took a wash basin and a towel, but he began to wash the disciples' feet in John chapter 13. Jesus did two things differently than what's done in a typical Jewish Passover. In a typical Jewish Passover, the father of the household has his hands washed first. But in Yeshua's Passover, he did the washing. And in the traditional Jewish Passover, everyone has their hands washed. But in Messiah's Passover, he washed the disciples' feet. And so he was intending to teach his disciples an object lesson. He said, if I, your Messiah, your master, your head of the Passover table, is willing to wash your feet, certainly you ought to be willing to wash one another's feet, or you ought to be willing to serve one another. So he used this as a means of teaching them and giving them an object lesson of servitude one for the other. After everyone has their hands washed, the Father has on his Seder plate parsley. And he has each person take out a sprig of the parsley. And then alongside of the parsley is a little bowl of salt water. Everyone swishes the parsley into the salt water. They say the blessing. And the blessing says, Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech ha'olam, borei peri ha'adamah. Blessed are you, O Lord our God, King of the universe, who brings forth or creates the fruit of the earth. And everyone would eat together. Now, the reason they eat these two different elements is because they too have symbolic significance. The parsley is to symbolize the springtime of the year when Passover is celebrated. It's also meant to remind us of the hyssop leaves, which is dipped into the basin of blood to sprinkle on the two side doorposts and upper lintel to protect the firstborn in the time of the Exodus from Egypt. The salt water is to remind us of the Red Sea through which the Jewish people exited from the land of Egypt. The Red Sea. Ask, which one is it? And Jesus said, the one who dips his hand with me in the dish. He was referring to the dipping of the parsley into the salt water, which he used to symbolize who the betrayer. He breaks it in half, and then he wraps it in a linen cloth. And then he tucks it away to take out at a later time of the service. When he breaks the matzah, he says this prayer, Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech ha'olam, hamotzi lechem min ha'aretz. Blessed are you, O Lord our God, King of the universe, who brings forth bread from the earth. At this point, the youngest son would be asked to recite the 4 questions. The 4 questions are designed to get the father to tell the story of Passover. And these 4 questions have a melody to it, and it's really quite a beautiful song that is sung as the 4 questions are recited. So partake with us and join us as our worship team leads us in the singing of the Manish Tana, the 4 questions.
הלילה הזה מכל הלילות, מכל הלילות, שבכל הלילות אנו אוכלים חמץ ומצה, חמץ ומצה. הלילה הזה כולו מצה. שבכל הלילות אנו אוכלים שאר ירקות, שאר ירקות. הלילה הזה מרור, הלילה הזה מרור, שבכל הלילות אין אנו מגבילים אפילו פעם אחד, אפילו פעם אחד. הלילה הזה שתי פעמים, הלילה הזה שתי פעמים, שבכל הלילות אנו אוכלים באין יושבים ובין מסובים. הלילה הזה כולנו מסובים, הלילה הזה כולנו מסובים. כולו מצב מרור, שתי פעמים כולנו מסובים.
Now, when the song was sung, the questions that the youngest son had asked simply were, on all the other nights we may eat either leavened or unleavened bread, but on this night only unleavened bread. So tonight we eat matzah, the unleavened bread, because Passover begins the 8-day festival of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So all leaven has to be out of our homes. The second question that was asked was, on all other nights we may eat all kinds of herbs, but on this night only bitter herbs. And so tonight we'll eat the moror, which comes from the word to be bitter, these bitter herbs. And so what we eat tonight is the horseradish. We'll talk more about that when we get to the second dipping. Thirdly, on all other nights, we do not dip even once, but on this night, we dip twice. So the first dipping was the dipping of the parsley into the salt water. And we said that the parsley represented the springtime of the year, and it also represented the hyssop leaves, which was dipped into the basin of blood to sprinkle the blood of the lamb on the two side doorposts and upper lintel during the time of Moses. And then the salt water we partake of, and we dip the parsley into it because it reminds us of the tears which the Jewish people shed in Egypt, and also it reminds us of the saltwater body of water, the Red Sea, through which the Jewish people exited from the land of Egypt. And then fourthly, this youngest son asks, on all other night we may eat either sitting or reclining, but on this night we all recline. And so traditionally on Passover, everyone gets a pillow and everyone reclines on their left elbow. So everyone reclines on the left. And that's because if in the ancient world, if you were a slave, you ate standing up or sitting erect. But if you were a free person, you ate reclining. And that's why when we read the account of Messiah's Passover, it speaks over and over again of the disciples reclining at the table. Because at Passover, everyone reclines because we are celebrating our freedom from slavery. Now, having partaken of the first cup, washed our hands, had performed the first dipping, we also had broken the matzah, wrapped it up. Then we come to the second cup. And the first cup was called the Kiddush Cup. It separates this night from all other nights. The second cup is the cup of plagues. And we're reminded of the 10 plagues. And so everyone takes their cup and they dip their finger into the cup. And with each drop that they put on their plate, they recite the 10 plagues in unison to remind us of the means by which God brought judgment on the Egyptians and deliverance for his people. So they'll dip their finger into the cup and we'll say, blood, frogs, lice, flies, cattle plague, boils, hail, locusts, darkness, and the slaying of the firstborn. Now, once the 10 plagues are remembered and are recited in that way, then we sing a song. We sing the song called Dayenu. It would be sufficient. And so the words of that song say, had he taken us out of Egypt, but had not brought judgment upon our adversaries, Dayenu, it would have been sufficient. Had he brought judgment upon our adversaries, but not allowed us to pass through the sea on dry ground, Dayenu. Had he allowed us to pass through the sea on dry ground, but not destroyed our foes in it, Dayenu. Had he destroyed our foes, but not satisfied our needs in the wilderness for 40 years, Dayenu. Had he satisfied our needs in the wilderness for 40 years and not given us the Torah, Dayenu. Had he given us the Torah, but not Messiah, our atonement, Dayenu. In other words, God does more than what is sufficient. It would be sufficient if he just did that, but he does more and more and more because he's a gracious God. He's a compassionate God. He's a loving God. And that's why he sent his son, Yeshua the Messiah, into our world. Because even though it was sufficient that he might have left us in our misery of our sin, but for God, he desires to save us, to redeem us, to restore us. And thus Messiah has come into our world to provide us with life everlasting. And his coming has made it Dayenu. It is sufficient. And he saves to the uttermost. So why don't you join us as we sing together this wonderful song, Dayenu, it would be sufficient. Kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu al achilat matzah. Blessed are you, O Lord our God, King of the universe, who has sanctified us with your commandments and has commanded us to eat the unleavened bread. And then after they partake of the matzah together, then the Father breaks off an additional piece of matzah. He then dips it into the maror, the horseradish, the bitter herbs. And then he says the blessing. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu, al achilat moror. Blessed are you, O Lord our God, King of the universe, who has sanctified us with your commandments and has commanded us to eat the bitter herbs. Now, the reason we eat the bitter herbs is because it's not enough just to be reminded of the bitterness of bondage. We must experience that bitterness as well. And so just as the bitterness in the Egyptian bondage brought tears to the Jewish people's eyes, so we're to eat the moror, the bitter herbs, so that it would bring tears to our eyes. And then the Father then breaks off 2 pieces of matzah for everyone. And now he makes a little sandwich. He has the bitter herbs, the moror, in one hand. And then in the other, he has this chopped nuts and apples mixed with the juice or the wine called horoset. It's to turn brown because it's to remind us of the mortar with which the Jewish people made bricks in the land of Egypt. It's very sweet and very tasty. And so the father will dip his matzah into the horoset, and then he'll dip the other matzah into the moror, and then he'll make a little sandwich. He'll say the blessing, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu al achilat moror. Blessed are you, O Lord, our God, King of the universe, who has sanctified us with your commandments and commanded us to eat the bitter herbs. Now, this second dipping, where we have the dipping of the matzah into the moror, the bitter herbs, and the dipping of the matzah into the horoset, the chopped nuts and apples, is our second dipping. The first dipping was the dipping of the parsley into the salt water. As we said before, the salt water represents the tears that were shed in Egypt, and also the Red Sea, a saltwater body of water through which the Israelites exited from the land of Egypt. And the parsley represents the springtime in which Passover is celebrated. And it also represents the hyssop leaves, which was dipped into the basin of blood to sprinkle on the two side doorposts and the upper lintel. And then we also talked about the moror, the bitter herbs that would bring tears to our eyes so that we would shed tears with our ancestors who shed tears in Egypt. And the horoset, the chopped nuts and apples, which represents the mortar with which the Jewish people made bricks. It's sweet and tasty because we're to be reminded that in the midst of our suffering, the moror, we had the hope of deliverance because of the sweet hope of God's promise. That sandwich in which we put the two together is known in the Jewish tradition and in the ancient world as the dipping of the sop. And that's our second of the two dippings. Remember, the first dipping, the disciples were told one of them would betray Messiah. They all began to ask which one would it be. The text says that John, while leaning back, so while he's reclining on Yeshua, he then leans back. It's as if he's whispering into Yeshua's ear so that no one else would hear. And he asks him, which one will betray you? Messiah says, the one that I give the sop to. The only one he would give the sop to is the one seated to his immediate left, so Judas was right alongside of him. And Judas knew that that indicated he was the betrayer because he asked Jesus, is it I, Lord? And Yeshua said, yes, it is, and what you must do, do quickly. Judas then leaves the table, and he goes to the leadership, and that was wrapped up, and he will say, this is my body broken for you. And then he will partake of the third cup, the partake of the
this bread